Welcome, everyone, to the Clocking Out Podcast, a show about people who share their own personal journey that include making bold choices to clock out of situations, to follow their dreams of career fulfillment, and to live their best, most authentic lives. I'm your host, Raymond Lee, and this podcast could not be possible without the support of Career Minds. More about Career Minds after the show. Today, I am excited to welcome Sophie Warwick. Sophie's the co-founder of The Thoughtful Co., a consultancy that supports women in negotiating their compensation and advises employers on improving gender equity in the workplace. I like to say that they are closing the gender gap one offer letter at a time. Sophie has a bachelor's and master's degree in structural engineering and practiced structural engineering consulting for over 7 years, where she saw firsthand the challenges employers face recruiting and retaining women in male-dominated environments. Sophie has a long history of building more inclusive and equitable environments for women. In 2018, she co-founded Women in Consulting Engineering, a nonprofit community devoted to supporting and empowering women in engineering. So last week, we met Sophie's co-founder, Jillian, for part one. And I have to say, I am excited to have Sophie here today for part two. So without further ado, please enjoy Sophie Warwick and her clocking out story. Sophie, welcome to the podcast. It's great to see you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I was just thinking, it's been a week. Last week, I had a terrific conversation with Jillian, your co-founder. And so this is a two-part series, and I'm really excited to hop in here. And for those who are listening, if you haven't heard last week's episode with Jillian Climby, who is Sophie's co-founder, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. And it's so interesting because, Sophie, when I think about and look at your career and sort of the pathway that you've chosen to get to where you are today as the co-founder of the Thoughtful Co., it is so interesting that you and Jillian's backgrounds in terms of your education and your work experience is vastly different. But it's just so interesting how over the last couple of years, you've come together with a very similar passion in a field that I think is just incredible, the kind of work that you're doing. So I just want to say kudos to you for everything that you're doing. And I'm just excited to have the opportunity to make this a two-part series. So excited to get to know you more.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to it. And yeah, there's a very non-linear career path so far, but it's been exciting along the way.
So what I typically like to do is sort of start from the beginning. Tell us where you're from, where'd you grow up, your parents, siblings, et cetera, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, it sounds great. So I grew up in Ottawa, Ontario originally, and my parents were from England originally. So they grew up in Marlow, and my brother and sister were born there and then moved to Canada for what was supposed to be 1 year shortly before I was born, and then 30 odd years later, here we are. So obviously that turned into a permanent position.
So I'm curious, your parents are from England. You have two older siblings who were born in England. They moved to Canada, and then you were born in Canada, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm the one outsider.
Well, so I'm curious, how is that in terms of growing up as a family? What was that like with your two siblings from England and you being born in Canada? What was that dynamic like? I'm just curious.
Yeah, we were always really close, but they did love to tease me as being the foreigner in the family because, on both sides, my mom's and my dad's, very far back, everyone's been born in the UK. So I'm the one outlier to that. But we went back a lot and we're really close with my family. So sometimes it was hard, not growing up close to your cousins or your grandparents and those types of things. But we did make a big effort to go visit them a lot and vice versa. So that part of it was really nice. And yeah, my brother and sister are closer in age, and then there's a larger age gap to me. So I definitely fall into some of the youngest child tendencies.
Nice. What did your parents do as a career?
My mom was a social worker, so she worked both in mental health and then also in child services. And then my dad was in IT. He worked for Nortel, and so very technically minded. And also, yeah, he has a patent actually for the first fiber optic cables that were used for like digital cable TV, which is really cool. And he's very
Oh,
modest and humble about that. I only learned about it 2 years ago.
oh wow, that's pretty cool. One of my HR jobs way back in the day was with Corning, and I was in their fiber optic division where they made fiber optic cable. Obviously, they're the glass company, and so can totally appreciate the work that your dad did there, and that's pretty impressive. Um, so the reason I was asking about your parents' background is that, I know that you ended up pursuing an engineering career, and I was wondering if there was any influence from your parents or any influence from anyone in your family that led you to that. And I'm curious, what led you into deciding engineering as a field that you were going to choose.
Yeah, I think definitely my dad had a lot of influence on that. I have a memory of doing a project when I was probably about 10, and it was making a little car and we had to race them with all of our classmates, and I just remember spending hours on it with my dad. I think it had to be all recycled material, so I was using CDs or something as wheels, and you had to it be self-powered. And I remember mine just blowing through, going so much farther than everyone else's. And I didn't really think about it, but one of my close friends, who I'm still friends with today, he always commented, I knew you'd be an engineer around then. It made sense.
That's great. How old were you at that time?
I think I was about 9 or 10.
Really? Oh, wow.
So I must have been deep in there because I didn't actively or consciously, think about engineering at that time. But there was obviously something that was interesting me.
Yeah, no, that's super. That is so cool. And, when you think about engineering, there's so many disciplines as well, mechanical, electrical, civil, structural. How did you figure out what discipline you were going to pursue?
Yeah, I remember spending a long time making that decision. We started in our first year with a general first year where you took courses from all of the different disciplines. And I definitely liked structural and mechanical. Those were the front runners early on. I also liked software as well. I think what I noticed is that I liked the ones that were little bit more tangible or spatial. So I found it harder to visualize something like chemical engineering. It was more abstract to me, whereas something that I could see and visualize. And then between structural and mechanical, it was those two until very close to the end of my first year when I had to make a decision and went really back and forth. But I think it was ultimately I did like my structural courses more. I did join a few classes where you could go to upper year courses and kind of see what they were learning, which was great because then I met a few more people who'd done internships and maybe learned a little bit more about what they did for an actual career. So, what working would look like. And so, at the time, I actually didn't end up going into bridge design, but that was what I really pictured doing.
Mm, that's interesting. So it led you to structural, it sounds like. Was there anything in mechanical that turned you off, or did you feel like that visual of the structural, which, by the way, I think is so much cooler personally, because it's just like, seeing the building versus, like how things are working within the building seems to be more impressive. But I'm just curious the distinction there.
Yeah, I think it was really seeing something I was interacting with so much daily. And it almost felt like more of a gut feeling of this feels like
Mm,
more what I'm good at, what I'm more interested in. And I felt more confident in it.
yeah. Well, I know that you ended up pursuing a master's degree, and I often wonder, when someone goes to get a graduate degree, if that's already planned in in your undergraduate studies, or what was the catalyst that prompted you to decide that getting a master's degree in engineering? I mean, really, you must have been pretty serious about this field because you ended up getting a master's degree in it. I'm curious why that?
Yeah, I actually hadn't intended to do a master's originally. And so after I graduated, I worked for a year in London, Ontario at a consulting firm there. So I was doing building design at the time, really liking it. And it was around then that I decided I wanted to move out west. And so a big difference in Ontario versus being on the west coast of Canada and the US is earthquake design, which is something I did learn a little bit about in school, but not potentially to the same degree. And also, a lot of the firms on the west coast definitely had some preference to people who had academic training on the west coast. So I decided to do my master's. I think in some ways, like, yes, to learn more information, but also to build connections out west just as much. And so I think back on my time in my master's, I did a course-based one, not thesis, although I did end up doing a thesis project as part of it. Um, I think it was really more about the opportunity to meet people based in Vancouver and connect with firms here. And so I feel like it put me in front of the right people,
Hmm.
almost to an equal point of new information that I learned to do my job. But I always honestly think I learned so much more working in some
Right.
ways because it's so much about the relationships and actually applying the theory, whereas sometimes I found my master's was very theoretical.
Hmm. I can't believe that is so interesting. How twofold you you chose this master's degree, and I was just thinking earthquake and structural. You moved to the West Coast because that's where all the earthquakes happen, and then positioning yourself in a place that allows you to network. That's like super impressive, and just seeing all of the academic work that you're doing is interesting because I know playing this forward, you kind of clocked out of the whole engineering field. You're still leveraging engineering today in a very different way, but it's just so interesting how it sounds like you were super thoughtful about not just picking a college, but finding a college in a city where it would complement actually the work that you're doing. I mean, that is just fascinating. Kudos to you for being so thoughtful because I don't even think that I put 3 minutes into determining where and how my degree was going to connect together. I think that's impressive.
Yeah, thank you. I think my greatest curse and strength is my excessive planning, which has been present from a very young age.
That's too funny. Okay, so you are out on the West Coast. You graduate with your master's, and then what? How did you sort of pivot into the working world? And tell us about your first real job where you were putting your engineering skills to work.
Yeah, so I ended up meeting one of the partners at Glotman Simpson, which is where I went on to work while I was doing my master's at UBC. And so I started working there before I'd finished my schooling and just finished my master's part-time after. And it was really exciting. I loved it. They worked on a lot of high profile, high rise buildings in Western Canada and the US, and a lot of concrete design, which is what I really liked the most. So I really enjoyed it. It was, I think, in that experience, it was very challenging, like a lot of learning. But what I loved is that yes, there was a lot of independent design work sitting at your desk. There was also a lot of coordinating with clients and other consultants and stakeholders, which I think was my greatest fear going into engineering is that I wasn't going to have that part of it. So as I started working, I think I found quite early on my favorite parts of my job were when I was doing more early schematic design with a client and answering questions for could we do this conceptually? And really finding creative solutions for, we have this really difficult problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to make a building look in a certain way, and it's going to be challenging structurally, but what are all the different ways that we could make it work that would, meet that same aesthetic in a different way? So I really liked that piece of it. And so, yeah, it was definitely challenging and a lot of learning, but I really enjoyed it.
Hmm. So forgive me for this question, but I'm just curious. I worked in the construction industry for years, and it's typically a male kind of dominated industry. And as a young female coming in as a structural engineer, highly educated, super smart, were there any sort of insecurities that you had to overcome? And I'm curious if you'd be willing to share what those were.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I was in school, it was definitely male dominated, but I don't think I noticed it impacting me in the same way because we were all, I guess, peers. We were at the same level. We were doing independent work. So the sort of politics that can sometimes come into that setting weren't as present. And then once I started in consulting, like engineering is very male dominated, but so is the development industry more broadly. So I very quickly found myself being the only woman in the room. And it was really challenging sometimes. I did have some good mentors that supported along the way, but also had a lot of challenges. I think big things that stuck out for me that were difficult were, I would spend some days the morning I might be on site at a meeting. And then in the afternoon, I would be in a consulting meeting that was a little bit more formal. And it's such a simple thing, but I honestly didn't know what to wear. Like men around me were wearing maybe formal jeans and a polo, and they fit in both of those settings. Whereas I didn't really have an equivalent that fit on site. And then I was finding myself changing to go dress up a little bit more to go to that consultant meeting. And, or I would be going out to do an inspection, and I'm not very tall. And I would be wearing this extra large men's safety vest. And I felt like it looked like I was a child on site and really trying to like have a commanding presence. And so there was pieces like that that I found hard. And I did sometimes find it's so hard to tell, and really be able to look at it through a lens. But I sometimes found in meetings that I felt I was being challenged more on things than someone else might. And I think part of that is because I didn't look the way someone might expect a structural engineer to look. And one specific example that jumps out at me is I was at a meeting with an architect, and there was the lead architect who would join periodically for meetings, but wasn't the working architect who was as actively involved in the project. So we'd met a handful of times, not very many. And we had a structural coordination meeting. So it was only the architecture team and the structural team, which was myself and another woman from my firm. And the lead architect came in and said, "Why is landscape here? This is supposed to be a structural or architecture meeting, and landscape is more traditionally dominated by women, or at least more equitable." And so I think instantly seeing two women in the room, he assumed we couldn't possibly be the structural engineers. And he did feel very bad after and profusely apologized. But it was, I think, those little moments where someone reminds you they weren't expecting you. And so sometimes when you're making a recommendation, it's sometimes fought a little bit more with, well, what do you know?
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. It's obviously, the bias just front and center there, and how uncomfortable it feels where obviously you're the recipient of that, and then you have to communicate back to him and say, no, I am the structural engineer, I'm not the landscaper. And there's obviously, it's an uncomfortable moment, and there's lots of work to be done there to minimize that bias in the workplace. And I wonder if as you reflect back what advice would you give to women who are in those technical roles who experience similar situations, or even to prepare, because it still exists today? You obviously had a self-awareness, and even as an at an early age had a mindset where you could recognize, and sort of like, you're not armoring up, but you really have an awareness and seem comfortable and confident in how you deal with that, which I think plays forward in the work that you're doing today. But I just wonder if you have any advice that you can give anyone that's listening that may be in a similar position.
Yeah, I think take it seriously and speak to someone about it. You find support, whether that's a colleague, your friend, a mentor, whoever it is. I think the more I do the work I do now, I meet with so many women or people from underrepresented groups that justify some of the strange behaviors that they experience because they don't maybe have someone to speak to about it. And it's easy to make excuses. And then potentially that reflects back on things like imposter syndrome and feeling like I
Mm,
need to work harder to prove my worth versus maybe there is a biased system that I'm operating in and that's why I'm receiving this. So I think finding community can be really helpful to just realize, oh, I'm not the only one that experiences this. And then once you have that opportunity to validate that, then you are able to, build that support, figure out how you're going to respond to it. And you feel more confident doing so and responding because you're not justifying and thinking, oh, well, maybe I did something to solicit that reaction, or maybe it was a one-off comment and I'm reading too much into it or I'm too sensitive. So
mm,
I think validating the experience through connection is the best first step.
mm. I appreciate that. I wonder also, so you were sharing the example of going to those meetings where you were kind of trying to figure out, what do I wear at the corporate meeting versus the more informal meeting? And was your comfort doing your own thing? Or did you feel like you had to sort of blend in with what everyone else was wearing? Jeans, steel toe shoes, hard hat, and some god awful, blue blaze, whatever it is, blue shirt with your name on it. Like, I'm just curious how you handled that.
Yeah, I feel like especially I did that on site, trying to just blend in. I personally detest polos. I think I look incredibly awkward in them, but I would
Mm-hmm.
always wear them to site. And yeah, trying to mimic what other people around me were wearing. I have a close friend that I worked with as well who she loves pinks and purples. And for the first few years of her career, just switched to wearing black all the time. And she actually started speaking in a lower voice. She didn't notice for a while until she bumped into an old friend and kind of caught herself out on it. But I
Yeah.
think she was trying to mirror the environment she was in. She was trying to fit in and felt that she would feel more successful. And I think a lot of us do that. If we feel that we stick out in some way, then it's so tempting to modify our behavior or the way we present so that we fit into that setting more closely. And I think if we have more diverse environments, then there's a lot less of that pressure because everyone's starting to present a little bit differently.
I love that. So, so tell me about, now I'd love to hear the clocking out story. Like, you've been doing this structural engineering work, not sure if it's still with the same company, but you're doing the engineering work. Share, when was the moment that you realized that the work that I do in engineering is going to be very different? And I'm just curious about that pivot, that shift into a new direction.
Yeah, it was honestly quite a slow transition in many ways. While I was still working at Gottman Simpson, I co-founded a nonprofit with a group of my colleagues there called Women in Consulting Engineering. And it started initially as a wine club, a few women getting together. We just felt that we didn't know too many women in the industry and we wanted to build our network. And so we had one event with about 20 people and got some feedback from that of how many other of their friends would love to attend something like this. So 2 months later, we were hosting an event for 80 people at a restaurant, and it's now an active nonprofit with monthly events. There's a new group of directors. I was co-chair for 3 years, and yeah, so it really stressed the appetite. And so I think in doing that work, that was when I first started to focus a lot more on equity, diversity, and inclusion, on maybe activism within women's experience in the engineering world. And while I was still doing that, I ended up trying out a new firm called Intuitive. So they're a Toronto-based firm that had opened a Vancouver office a couple years prior. And what was cool there is I was able to join in the launch of their employee resource groups, as well as they had an advocacy body. And so I was co-chair of both of those. So I worked on their gender balance pillar, which was the women's ERG. And I felt that they were doing really amazing work. And I thought, oh, this is amazing. This is a company that is really investing and doing things thoughtfully. And so I started to enjoy that work more and more, and also felt that there was a really good opportunity to bring those mindsets to other organizations where I felt like there was an appetite, but not a lot of resources. Like they didn't have teams in place to do that. So that all happened. And then I think, like many co-founders these days, the pandemic happened and you get a little bit of self-reflection and you're thinking about what you like doing. And through that time was when I really recognized I wanted to do more work in equity, diversity, and inclusion. I just didn't know what a job would look like. So I passively started looking at jobs that were available. I never really found something that felt like it was worth pursuing or the right fit, but I just kind of kept my eyes open to see what was out there. In the background, I was also debating pitching to my current employer to create a new position for myself where I just did that. I don't know if I would have been successful or not because it was going from, a very billable role to a more internal role. But that was something I was thinking about. And then around, 6 months into that process, Jillian, so my now co-founder, she had left Lululemon, and we talked a lot over the years about just women's experience in the workplace. We had connected on a lot of pieces around equity and building inclusive spaces. So when she left, it was my husband actually who told me, because they had gone to business school together. And I was like, oh, what is she doing? And he was like, oh, I don't know. I don't think she has something lined up.
So
So
they were
yeah.
so they were friends at Ivy. They were friends at the business school and had a friendship separately. And then when you were sort of going through this process of trying to figure out what's the next thing in terms of what you were going to do, and it sounds like you were grappling a little bit about the engineering, all the work that you've done, and then you're now having this new fire that is like drawing you to something completely different. And so your husband was like, oh, you should talk to Jillian, who has a similar fire. So it's that connection that really, that's when you all met for the first time.
Yeah, exactly. It was so serendipitous in so many
Wow.
ways. Like we had kind of done these week or annual hiking or camping trips with the six of us. It was my husband, Jillian, her husband. They both went to Ivy with Alex, and then two other friends. And so I knew Jill, but not, incredibly well. So it seemed so serendipitous in some ways. It just felt like the right fit. So I reached out to her. We ended up going for sushi, and I just told her what I had been thinking about, and she was kind of in a different direction but similar space, like wanting to, or coming at it from a different background, I guess I should say, but really wanting to work in a similar space. And then she said, well, I have this website and I don't know what it is, but it's called The Thoughtful Co. And so we started, I think it was in that first meeting, we just committed to starting a blog, and we decided we could think about things that we were passionate about and start writing about them. And then slowly over a couple of months, we started to hone in on what our services could be and would be. And then eventually it just grew into what it is now. But I have so many memories of early on people making recommendations and giving advice on making sure you find the right co-founder and that it's the perfect fit and you do all this vetting. And we've always had, such an incredible partnership relationship. And it wasn't necessarily super intentional in many ways. It just worked out really well. So we feel very lucky in that we didn't really seek out who was going to be the best type of co-founder that I could work with. We just had a lot of aligned values, wanted to do something similar. And I think we have the right strengths that are unique and complement, but also, very similar in what we're trying to achieve. So we work super well together.
I love that. So I got to unpack a couple of things here. I love the fact that the universe was sort of working its magic, because the best scenarios are the ones that aren't planned, I feel like, where it comes together and it just feels right. And there's so many components of it that, in terms of like the success of it, everything, when the stars align, that kind of recipe, I believe, is like the recipe for success. So I just love that story. And when you were mentioning about the blog, I'm curious, was there an overlap in the work that you were doing in your job? And then you were having these thoughts, because I know Jillian left Lululemon on her own without anything to go to. So she was sort of in this space. She said she was taking up hobbies, playing the piano and all these instruments. So she was kind of on her journey. But I just wonder, on your journey, were you still at the company when you met and then you started to do the blog together? I'm wondering what that looked like.
Yeah, I was still at the company and stayed for another about 12 months. So I was there for a while as we started. And so I disclosed to them, which was great. So it made it less scary. I was, I'm working on this blog, and that was helpful. It was nice in that, what I was at least doing at work was different in some ways. I was still doing all the work with the employee resource groups and the advocacy bodies within the company. So that was still really nice to be continuing that. And then I was still at the time co-chair of WCE, the nonprofit I'd started. So I had a lot of things that were similar and complementary. I knew for a while I was just really hoping that it would take off and that I could do that full time. So there was definitely some challenges along the way where, you feel a little bit like you're burning out, but it didn't feel like I was quite ready to jump in fully to do it, to be able to support both of us. But I remember giving myself, I think I said till like the October of 2022, I had to make a call one way or the other. I can't have my two jobs. It's a little bit too much.
Yeah.
And then around August, we got our first big client, and it just felt like, okay, I have the comfort and the runway to do this. And was able to just go for it. And my company was actually super supportive when I did leave, which was amazing. So I actually did a part-time exit which was very mutually beneficial. I had some predictable income for a bit. I also wrapped up a number of projects, so no one had to take over them. So it actually worked out really well. And it's funny, both Jillian and I joke about we're incredibly risk averse. So it's very ironic that we ended up being entrepreneurs. But
I love that.
I think, yeah, it's very unexpected.
Yeah,
but I think
it's great.
what helped, like that jump to depart can be so scary. But I think for me, what made it easier is I actually wrote myself a list of conditions. So it felt like not an emotional decision. So I said, when we're making this much average revenue per month, when we have this much forecasted, I increased my emergency fund that I had saved up. So I figured I had more access to cash if things weren't going well. And so once all of those things were in place, it felt easier to say, well, I met the conditions. I can do it. So that
Hmm.
made it a little bit less scary.
So Sophie, you had three things that were going on. You had the blog that you were working on. You had the company that you were working at. You were involved in this nonprofit. So you had these three things going on. And I love the fact that you were transparent with your company, because I think sometimes people get really nervous about going to their company and sharing the extracurricular things that they're doing that they're passionate about, in fear that the company is going to think that you're going to be looking to jump ship. And so I just want to say kudos to, being vulnerable and sharing what you're doing and being transparent, so that when it kind of played forward and then you went to them and said, hey, I want to do this full time, that they absolutely valued you and your commitment to the company, and they provided a really nice transition for you during that period, in 2020, so that you could really pursue your dreams with Jillian in this company. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, it made such a difference in both, like, I had so much fear when I leading up to disclosing, but it felt so much better to be open and I could be transparent at work. Like, I hate the feeling of showing up in a space where I feel like I have a secret or I can't show up as myself. And then, as you said, it did so help my relationships with that company when I left. I still feel like I have great support from them and they still check in to see how things are going. And I don't know if that would have happened if it had
Mm,
played out in a different way and I hadn't disclosed. So they were so supportive. And that was such a wonderful way to feel excited about leaving. And I'm sure it would have felt a lot scarier if I had left in a really contentious or stressful way.
yeah. So now you're both running the company, and for you as an entrepreneur coming in as a co-founder, I'm curious, once you left your last company, you have this big project, it's 2022, the honeymoon period is over, and let's say the project's done and successful. Is there a moment where you two look at each other and say, what are we doing? Like, there's never a clear linear pathway for entrepreneurs to hit success. There's got to be a moment where you question, like, are we really going to make something of this? And I just wonder, I didn't ask Jillian this question, but I am curious from your perspective, as someone who's left this amazing engineering career, which is vastly different than the path that Jillian take, because she was always in the field that she was in related to executive compensation. And so I just wonder, was there a moment after you started the Thoughtful Co where you just said, you sort of second guess whether you made the right decision?
Yeah, I think like two things came up. One is I had spent, as we were talking about earlier, so many years studying to be an engineer and practicing and also advocating for women to be retained in the profession. And so the irony is not lost on me that I am one of the ones that left. So I felt conflicted about that initially because it felt like, well, I should stay because I've been talking about keeping women in the industry for so long. But I tried to justify that to myself with, I'm supporting other women in building environments that are more sustainable to more diverse individuals. And I remember talking to one of my mentors at Intuitive as I was leaving, and she was so incredibly supportive. And she was also like, are you going to maintain your license? And, you've worked so hard for it. And I did decide to maintain my license, so I still do today. So I'm just registered as a non-practicing engineer because it did feel nice. I did work a long time for that to maintain it. And then the other piece of, I think, uncertainty that I had was getting used to the up and downs of entrepreneurship. Like I had always worked in such a predictable environment.
Mm.
And then all of a sudden you have really busy months and slow months. And at the beginning, a slow month would be really stressful. And a really great month would be amazing. And I'd be elated. And I remember we were about to sign a big contract with a new client. And I was so excited telling my husband about it. They hadn't signed the contract yet, but it was seeming really promising. And we were driving somewhere and he was just like, oh, that's great. And then didn't chat about it more. And I was so annoyed. I thought, I'm about to do this amazing thing. And he was like, no, I'm not celebrating that, but make sure you don't get too high and too low, especially before something certain. Like definitely celebrate once you get ink on paper. And then, but he was a big advocate and support for, don't go too high or too low, try and stay more in the middle. And I think Jill brought that up initially when I started too, because she'd had at that time about 9 months or so of navigating those ups and downs. And so I remember her saying early on, don't worry, it's a bit weird at first, but you get used to it. And so I think very quickly, actually, within a couple of months, it became easier to say, okay, yeah, this is a slow month, but we'll figure it out next month. We'll pivot. I think one of our catchphrases in our first year was pivot, actually, because anytime if something wasn't landing, we would just follow what was. And that I think really led to a lot of our success in our first year.
I love that. That's great. And so tell us a little bit about what the Thoughtful Co. focuses on. Jill shared in last week what you do as a company, and I just would love for you to share in your own words. Tell us about the company, what you're focused on, your role, and then we'll share how people can find you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we focus on three core things. The first is we coach individuals in negotiating their compensation. So that can be for performance reviews, promotions, new job offers, or just anytime someone wants to bring up compensation with their leader. So we do that through one-on-one coaching as well as contract reviews. And then the second piece is we advise employers on building more inclusive spaces with a special focus on gender equity. And that we work predominantly in companies in engineering, construction, and tech, just more traditionally male-dominated industries, and also very technically minded industries. We're very passionate about the metrics, measuring success, defining purpose. And I think that really appeals to a lot of our clients. And then the third piece, which is really a blend of the first two, is that we host workshops for a variety of professional organizations and for employers across Canada, the US, and the UK. And so for those, we'll cover topics around personal and professional development. So maybe that's compensation negotiation or advocating for yourself at work or how to build mentorship relationships. And then also some topics around more policy focused, so actionable strategies to build inclusive spaces or how to become an active ally and those types of conversations. So it's very tied to, my core values and a lot of what I built. And actually jumping back to kind of earlier in our conversation, when I think about my parents and what each of them did in their careers, I feel like it is such a blend of both of them in that it's very technical and metrics based, which is, very much in line with how my dad spent his career, but very socially driven, which was so much how my mom spent her career. And I feel like she has always been such an inspiration to me in advocating for those who maybe don't have the voices to advocate for themselves. And so I think so much of her is influenced what I do now in my career.
I love that. I love how you tied your mission, your values, your experience to your mom and your dad. That's so touching. And I shared with Jillian last week, it could be a tagline, I don't know, but how I describe the Thoughtful Co. is that you all are closing the gender pay gap one offer letter at a time.
Oh, I love that. I think we might have
Yeah,
to take that.
it's yours. I was kind of making some notes, and I'm a visual person, and so for someone who's in the career space and also recognizes that there's a lot of work to be done in that area, I think that I always try to think about like how do you articulate that in a way that really connects with people. And so, yes, feel free to take that. And the other thing, Sophie, that I love is how you focused on engineering and construction and consulting is a vertical. It makes a ton of sense, and in that you're not trying to be the specialist for all industries. And so the fact that you've honed in on an industry that you're comfortable in, you've maintained your license. I think it brings a lot of credibility in the work that you're doing on the corporate side of things, and then really honing in on women who are looking to maximize their pay within organizations. So really love the focus, and I'm going to share in the notes all of your information, but share with people how they can find the company, your social media, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find us on our website at thethoughtfulco.net or on LinkedIn at The Thoughtful Co. or on Instagram at thethoughtful.co. And yeah, always, we love to share statistics and details about equity within the engineering and construction and tech industries, as well as on the gender pay gap and looking for tips and strategies on how to, build more inclusive and equitable spaces. So yeah, always love to chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I feel just incredibly grateful that I met you and Jillian just like a month ago. We connected, I think serendipitously, and we're in a similar space. And when I met you, I was like, both of you, I just said to myself, what just fascinating stories. And so just really appreciate you all carving time out to share your story with our listeners. And just thank you so much for your story and all the great work that you're doing. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much as well. It's been such a great discussion and yeah, really thoughtful questions.
Hmm.
No pun intended on the name there.
I was just thinking the same thing. I think between you and Jillian, you said the word thoughtful, and you said built probably a half a dozen of times. So it's just interesting the word choices there. But yeah, my pleasure. And thanks everyone for listening. Until next time. Hello, Raymond again here. Thank you again to our sponsor, Career Minds, a global provider of outplacement and leadership development services. You can learn more about Career Minds at careerminds.com. And if you'd like to connect with me about your own personal career journey, you can connect with me on LinkedIn as well as on Instagram at raymondlee.co. Until next time, remember, if you're stuck or unsure of your career or future and think it's time for a change, I would encourage you to ask yourself these 3 simple questions. Does my career or work make me feel alive? Am I doing the things that matter to me most? And am I creating value for myself and for others? Until next time.